He promised to marry the poor girl in kindergarten. 30 years later, the CEO did. But what happens when a childhood promise made by two little kids who barely understood the world suddenly comes roaring back into their adult lives? A poor community worker fighting to save her neighborhood. A powerful CEO who thought he buried his past. And a promise so old it should have been forgotten forever. But when he sees her again, on a viral video standing in front of a bulldozer, everything inside him stops. Because she isn't just some stranger. She's the girl he promised his whole heart to before life tore them apart. And when a plastic toy ring from their childhood suddenly resurfaces, the truth becomes even more unbelievable. Why did he keep it for 30 years? And what secret destroyed their bond in the first place? Now the world is watching, his company is collapsing, and her entire community is on the line. Can a broken man keep a promise he made as a little boy? Or will the past ruin their future forever? Thank you for being here. If something in this story stayed with you, I'd love to see you again. Subscribe, and tomorrow I'll bring you another story crafted with heart. The September morning dawned bright and clear, sunlight streaming through the worn windows of Lincoln Elementary School. Inside a cheerfully decorated kindergarten classroom, little Aaliyah Carter stood quietly in the doorway, her small hand gripping the doorframe. Her dark eyes took in the chaos of first-day jitters as other children rushed around, some crying, others laughing. The plastic ring in her pocket was smooth and familiar against her fingers, a simple treasure she'd found in the playground at her foster home. It wasn't worth anything real, just a purple piece of plastic with a little star on top. But it made her feel brave. She'd spent the whole morning rubbing it like a good luck charm. Miss Thompson, the kindergarten teacher, spotted her and walked over with a warm smile. "Hello there. You must be Aaliyah. Would you like to find your cubby?" Aaliyah nodded, following the teacher to a row of small storage spaces marked with construction paper name tags. As she carefully placed her worn backpack inside, a commotion at the classroom door caught everyone's attention. A small boy with sandy brown hair stood frozen in the entrance, his brand-new leather backpack clutched tightly to his chest. Behind him, a tall man in a dark suit checked his watch impatiently. "Come now, Master Evan," the man said, his voice clipped and professional. "I have other duties to attend to." The boy, Evan, took one hesitant step into the classroom, his lower lip trembling. The man in the suit gave a curt nod and departed without another word, leaving Evan looking lost and alone in the doorway. Miss Thompson hurried over. "Welcome, Evan. We're so happy to have you join us." She gestured toward the cubbies. "Would you like to put your things away?" Evan's eyes welled up with tears. His chin quivered as he shook his head, clutching his backpack even tighter. A few other children stared, making him shrink further into himself. Aaliyah watched from her cubby, recognizing the fear in his eyes. She knew what it felt like to be scared and alone. She'd felt that way at every new foster home. Without thinking too hard about it, she slipped her hand into her pocket and wrapped her fingers around her plastic ring. Taking small, careful steps, she approached Evan. His eyes were squeezed shut now, tears rolling down his cheeks as he tried to hold back sobs. Aaliyah gently touched his arm. "Hi," she said softly. "I'm Aaliyah." Evan's eyes fluttered open, meeting hers through his tears. He hiccuped slightly, but didn't pull away. "I have something special," Aaliyah continued, her voice barely above a whisper. She pulled out the purple ring, holding it up so it caught the morning light. "It's magic. It makes scary things not so scary anymore." Evan's sobs quieted as he stared at the ring, curiosity replacing some of his fear. "Really?" Aaliyah nodded solemnly. "It works best if you wear it." She held it out to him. "You can have it." "But..." Evan sniffled. "Won't you be scared without it?" I'll be okay, Aaliyah said, giving him a small smile. You need it more right now. With trembling fingers, Evan took the ring. It was too small for any of his fingers, but he clutched it tightly in his palm, and his breathing began to steady. Miss Thompson, who had been watching the exchange with gentle interest, knelt beside them. That was very kind of you, Aaliyah. Evan, would you like to sit with Aaliyah during circle time? Evan nodded, and Aaliyah led him to the colorful carpet where other children were gathering. As they sat down together, Evan turned to her with serious eyes. When we grow up, he declared with the absolute certainty only a 5-year-old could muster, I'm going to marry you. Then we can always be together, and you'll never have to be scared either. Miss Thompson, overhearing this, couldn't help but smile at the innocent sweetness of the moment. Aaliyah felt her cheeks warm, but she smiled too, especially when she saw Evan was no longer crying. The morning passed in a blur of songs, stories, and getting-to-know-you games. When snack time came, Evan and Aaliyah sat together at a small table, sharing apple slices and graham crackers. Evan kept checking his palm where he'd stored the ring, as if making sure it was still there. My daddy has lots of rings, he told Aaliyah between bites. But they're not as pretty as this one. Aaliyah watched him carefully secure the ring in his backpack pocket during cleanup time. You really like it? She asked. It's the best present ever, he replied with complete sincerity. When the final bell rang, Aaliyah stood with Evan by the classroom door. Through the window, they could see the same black car from that morning waiting in the pickup lane. The man in the suit stood beside it, looking impatient. That's Charles, Evan explained, his voice getting smaller. He takes care of me when Daddy's working, which is always. Aaliyah felt a familiar ache in her chest. She knew about adults who were always too busy. She reached out and gave Evan's hand a quick squeeze. See you tomorrow? Evan brightened. Tomorrow? He agreed, carefully patting the pocket where he'd stored the ring. Aaliyah waved as he walked to the car, watching as Charles opened the door and Evan climbed inside. The luxury vehicle pulled away from the curb, its tinted windows reflecting the afternoon sun. Neither child knew it then, but it would be many years before their paths would cross again. The plastic ring, that simple token of childhood kindness, would become a memory preserved in time, a moment of pure connection between two lonely souls who found each other on their very first day of school. Miss Thompson watched the scene from her classroom door, touched by the unexpected friendship that had bloomed between these two very different children. She saw Aaliyah standing there, still waving long after the car had turned the corner, and gently placed a hand on the little girl's shoulder. Time to go inside, sweetheart. Your foster mother will be here soon. Aaliyah nodded, taking one last look at the empty street before following her teacher back into the classroom. The first day of kindergarten was ending, and while one chapter of their story was closing, neither Aaliyah nor Evan could have imagined how their paths would eventually intertwine again, or how that simple plastic ring would echo through the years to come. The next morning dawned bright and crisp, filled with the kind of September sunshine that made everything look fresh and new. Aaliyah arrived early, her small backpack bouncing against her shoulders as she practically skipped into the classroom. Her eyes immediately went to the seat where Evan had sat yesterday, but it was empty. She wasn't worried. There was still plenty of time before the bell would ring. She busied herself arranging her crayons just the way she liked them, occasionally glancing toward the door. Other children filtered in, hanging up their backpacks and chattering about what they'd had for breakfast. Still no Evan. When the final bell rang and Miss Thompson closed the classroom door, Aaliyah's heart sank. The empty chair beside her seemed to grow bigger and bigger, making her feel smaller and smaller. During morning circle time, she couldn't focus on the alphabet song. her eyes constantly drifting to the classroom entrance. As the other children moved to their activity stations, Miss Thompson gently touched Aaliyah's shoulder. "Sweetheart, could you help me with something over here?" She led Aaliyah to a quiet corner by the reading nook, kneeling down so they were eye to eye. "Aaliyah," Miss Thompson began softly, "I need to tell you something about Evan." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Evan won't be coming back to our class. His father decided to send him to a different school." Aaliyah's lower lip trembled. But he said he'd see me today. He promised." Miss Thompson's heart ached at the confusion and hurt in the little girl's voice. "Sometimes grown-ups make decisions that children don't understand. It's not because of anything you did wrong. You were such a good friend to Evan yesterday." But Aaliyah wasn't convinced. She replayed everything from the day before in her mind, wondering if she'd somehow messed up. Maybe she shouldn't have given him her ring. Maybe she'd talked too much during snack time. Maybe if she'd been a better friend, he would have stayed. "Can you tell him I'm sorry?" she asked in a small voice. Miss Thompson gathered her into a gentle hug. "Oh, sweetheart, you have nothing to be sorry for. Sometimes life takes people in different directions, even when we wish it wouldn't." Throughout the day, Aaliyah went through the motions of kindergarten activities, but her heart wasn't in it. During art time, she drew a picture of two stick figures holding hands, one wearing a tiny purple circle on its finger. She carefully folded the paper and tucked it into her pocket, just in case Evan came back. The next day, Aaliyah was the first to arrive again. She stood by the window, watching each car that pulled up, hoping to see the shiny black one that had dropped Evan off. But it never came. Days turned into weeks. Autumn leaves changed color and fell from the trees outside their classroom window. Aaliyah stopped waiting by the door every morning, though she never stopped hoping. Sometimes during recess, she would sit on the swings alone, remembering how Evan had promised to marry her, so they could always be together. It seemed silly now, but it had felt so real that day. As the school year progressed, Aaliyah adapted to the familiar rhythm of foster care life. New children came and went from her foster home, just as they always had. She learned not to get too attached, not to expect anyone to stay. But sometimes, late at night, she would remember the boy who had cried on his first day of school, and how it had felt to make him smile. The years passed, bringing changes both big and small. Aaliyah moved through different foster homes, different schools, different cities. She grew taller, learned to braid her own hair, and discovered she had a talent for helping other foster kids adjust to new situations. Perhaps it started with that day in kindergarten, when she'd known exactly how to comfort a crying boy with a plastic ring. By the time she reached high school, the memory of Evan had faded like an old photograph, the edges soft and blurry. One autumn afternoon, during her freshman year, Aaliyah sat on a bench outside her current school, watching a group of elementary kids playing on the playground next door. Their laughter carried across the fence, and something about it tugged at her heart. 2 small children were sharing a swing, taking turns pushing each other. The sight triggered something in her memory, a flash of a tear-stained face, a purple ring catching the sunlight, a promise made with the pure conviction of childhood. For a moment she could almost see him clearly, the boy with the soft smile who had been her friend for just one day. But the bell rang, calling her back to the present, and the memory slipped away like morning mist. Aaliyah gathered her books and headed to class, leaving behind the echoes of a kindergarten classroom from long ago. The young woman she had become understood what the little girl hadn't, that some people were only meant to be in our lives for a moment, leaving footprints on our hearts before continuing on their own paths. That afternoon, as she walked home from school, Aaliyah passed a little girl crying on the sidewalk, having fallen and scraped her knee. Without hesitation, Aliyah stopped to help, offering comfort and a band-aid from her backpack. As she walked away, she didn't realize that somewhere deep inside, she was still that same compassionate kindergartner who had known exactly how to make a scared little boy feel better with nothing more than a plastic ring and a kind heart. The morning sun painted warm stripes across the worn linoleum floor of the Hope Haven Community Center as Aliyah Carter organized files at her desk. 25 years had transformed the shy kindergartner into a composed woman with determination in her eyes and gentle strength in her bearing. Her natural hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her simple business casual attire spoke of practicality rather than fashion. Through the open door of her office, she could hear the familiar sounds of the shelter coming alive. Seniors chatting over morning coffee in the common room, teenagers helping with breakfast prep in the kitchen, and the steady hum of ancient heating units working overtime. These sounds had become the soundtrack of her life over the past 5 years since she'd taken the position as lead counselor. "Miss Carter." 12-year-old Marcus burst into her office, his worn sneakers squeaking on the floor. "There's people putting up fences outside." Aliyah frowned, rising from her desk. "What kind of fences?" "The big metal ones, like they use at construction sites." Marcus explained, pulling at her hand. "Mrs. Washington sent me to get you." Outside, a small crowd had gathered on the sidewalk. Eleanor Washington, a 73-year-old resident who had lived at Hope Haven for 15 years, stood at the front, leaning on her cane and arguing with a man in a hard hat. "You can't just show up and start putting fences around people's homes." Eleanor's voice carried across the morning air. Aliyah quickened her pace, her heart pounding. As she approached, she saw 3 construction vehicles, including a bulldozer, parked along the street. Workers were already setting up temporary fencing around the property's perimeter. "Ma'am," the foreman was saying to Eleanor, "we have city approval for this project. The demolition permit was approved last week." "Demolition?" Aliyah stepped forward, placing a steadying hand on Eleanor's shoulder. "There must be some mistake. This is an active shelter serving over 50 residents." The foreman pulled out a clipboard. "No mistake. The property's been sold for redevelopment. We're here to secure the site before demolition begins next week." "Next week?" Aliyah's voice rose in disbelief. "That's impossible. We haven't received any formal notice. There are elderly people living here, children who depend on our after-school programs." More residents were streaming out of the building now, drawn by the commotion. Teenagers from the youth program stood in clusters, filming with their phones. Several seniors who used walkers were being helped down the front steps by staff members. The foreman shrugged. "Look, I just follow orders. The paperwork says this place is coming down to make way for the Whitford Plaza, luxury condos and retail space." Aliyah's hands clenched into fists. "Show me the documentation." He handed over the clipboard, and Aliyah scanned the papers, her stomach churning. The permits appeared legitimate, but something felt wrong. How could this happen without any warning? The sound of the bulldozer's engine roaring to life snapped her attention back to the present. Without thinking, she handed the clipboard back and strode toward the massive yellow machine as it began to move toward the building. "Stop!" she shouted, planting herself directly in its path. Her heart hammered in her chest, but her voice remained steady. "You are not demolishing this building today or any day until we see proper documentation and our residents receive due notice." The bulldozer ground to a halt, mere feet from where she stood. Around her, phones recorded the confrontation as more neighbors gathered. The foreman jogged over, his face red with frustration. "Ma'am, you need to move. This is a legal operation." "Legal doesn't make it right," Aliyah replied firmly. "These are people's homes. This is a community institution that served this neighborhood for over 40 years. We're not going anywhere without a fight." Murmurs of agreement rose from the crowd. Eleanor stepped forward, followed by several other residents, Marcus and his friends formed a line beside Aaliyah, their phones still recording. "If you want to tear down Hope Haven," Aaliyah continued, "you'll have to go through proper channels. Our residents deserve respect and time to make alternative arrangements, if it comes to that." The standoff lasted several tense minutes before the foreman finally signaled the bulldozer to back up. "Fine, we'll suspend operations today, but we'll be back. This project is happening whether you like it or not." As the construction crews packed up their equipment, leaving only the partially installed fencing behind, Aaliyah's phone began buzzing with notifications. The videos were already spreading across social media, accompanied by hashtags like Save Hope Haven and Community Over Profit. The rest of the day passed in a blur of phone calls, impromptu meetings, and attempts to calm worried residents. By evening, Aaliyah had organized an emergency community meeting in the shelter's main hall. More than 100 people packed the space: residents, neighbors, local activists, and even a few news reporters. "We need legal representation," Maria Santos, a local business owner, pointed out during the discussion. "These developers think they can just steamroll over us because we're a low-income neighborhood." "I know some lawyers who might help pro bono," offered James Chen, another community leader. "But we'll need to move fast." For 3 hours they strategized, formed committees, and began building a resistance plan. Aaliyah's throat was raw from speaking, but she kept going, making sure everyone's voice was heard. This wasn't just about a building. It was about people's lives, their community, their dignity. Finally, well past 10 o'clock, Aaliyah unlocked her apartment door just down the street from Hope Haven. She hadn't wanted to live far from the people she served, even when friends suggested she could afford a better neighborhood. This was her home. These were her people. She kicked off her shoes and collapsed onto her worn but comfortable couch, not even bothering to change out of her work clothes. Her phone continued buzzing. The video of her confrontation with the bulldozer had gone viral, being shared thousands of times across multiple platforms. Exhaustion swept over her as the adrenaline of the day finally wore off. But beneath the fatigue burned a fierce determination. Hope Haven had given her purpose, had shown her that family wasn't always about blood, but about choosing to stand together. She wouldn't let it be destroyed without a fight. As her eyes grew heavy, Aaliyah's last thoughts were of the faces she'd seen today. Eleanor's dignity, Marcus's youthful defiance, the worried looks of parents who depended on the after-school programs. She drifted off to sleep on her couch, unaware that among the thousands viewing her viral moment of resistance were eyes that would recognize her, eyes that hadn't seen her since a long-ago day in kindergarten when she'd given away a plastic ring to comfort a crying boy. The 40th floor boardroom of Whitford Technologies hummed with tension. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping view of the city skyline, but Evan Whitford's attention remained fixed on the quarterly projections displayed on the massive screen before him. His fingers drummed silently against the polished mahogany table as Bradley Morton, head of real estate development, detailed their latest acquisition plans. "The Hope Haven site is particularly promising," Bradley was saying, gesturing to a map of proposed developments. "Once cleared, we can begin construction on the luxury condos immediately. Conservative estimates put our return on investment at—" A quiet knock interrupted him. Sarah Chen, Evan's executive assistant for the past 5 years, stepped into the room. Her usual composed expression showed hints of concern. "I apologize for the interruption, Mr. Whitford, but there's a situation requiring your immediate attention." Evan nodded slightly. "Excuse me, gentlemen." He stood, straightening his perfectly tailored suit jacket. "Please continue the presentation. I'll return shortly." In the privacy of his corner office, Sarah pulled up a video on her tablet. "This was filmed at the Hope Haven site an hour ago. It's already gone viral with over 50,000 shares." The footage began playing, showing a construction site with a yellow bulldozer advancing toward an old brick building. Then a voice rang out, clear, strong, and somehow achingly familiar. "Stop!" Evan's breath caught in his throat. Even before the camera panned to show her face, something deep within him recognized that voice. When it finally focused on her, a beautiful black woman in her early 30s, standing fearlessly before the bulldozer, his world tilted on its axis. "Aaliyah," he whispered, the name falling from his lips before his conscious mind could catch up. "Sir." Sarah looked at him quizzically. I know her." His voice sounded strange to his own ears. "From a long time ago." On screen, Aaliyah continued addressing the construction crew, her passion evident in every word. She was different from the shy 5-year-old he remembered, stronger, more confident, but her essential warmth and determination remained unchanged. "Pull everything you can find about Hope Haven and—" He paused, swallowing hard. "And about Aaliyah Carter. Her background, current role, everything." Sarah nodded efficiently, though curiosity flickered in her eyes. "And the board meeting, sir?" The board meeting. Reality crashed back in. Evan straightened, composing himself. "Give me 2 minutes." Back in the boardroom, Bradley was detailing demolition schedules. "We can have the site cleared by end of week if we move quickly. These protest situations tend to escalate if we don't act decisively." "Stop the demolition." Evan's voice cut through the discussion like a blade. "I'm sorry?" Bradley blinked in confusion. "But sir, we've already invested—" "I said stop it. All work at Hope Haven is suspended indefinitely." Evan's tone left no room for argument. "Issue a statement acknowledging community concerns and our commitment to dialogue. Have legal review all documentation related to the project. I want to know exactly how we acquired this property and what promises were made." The board members exchanged worried glances. Richard Blackwood, the eldest board member and a friend of Evan's father, cleared his throat. "Evan, my boy, this is highly irregular. The shareholders elected me CEO because I know when to change course." Evan interrupted coolly. "We're stopping the demolition. That's final." Hours later, long after the board members had departed and the office lights had dimmed, Evan sat alone at his desk. His computer screen displayed article after article about Hope Haven and its fierce defender. Aaliyah Carter, community counselor, former foster child, graduate of the State University with honors in social work, recipient of local leadership awards. The articles painted a picture of a woman dedicated to serving others who had transformed her own difficult experiences into a mission to help those in need. His eyes kept returning to the video, paused on her face. 25 years had passed since that first day of kindergarten, yet he could still feel the weight of that plastic ring she'd given him, still remember how her simple act of kindness had cut through his loneliness. The ring itself was long gone, probably lost in one of the many moves between private schools after his father had yanked him from public education. But the memory remained, crystallized in his mind. Her gentle smile, a tiny hand holding out that treasure to make a crying stranger feel better. Evan leaned back in his chair, rubbing his tired eyes. The city lights twinkled beyond his window, and somewhere out there, Aaliyah was probably still working, still fighting for her community. He thought about the life she'd built, the strength she'd shown, while he'd followed the path laid out by his father. Prestigious schools, impressive acquisitions, perfect appearances masking inner emptiness. Sleep began to creep over him as the hour grew late, but he couldn't bring himself to leave. Instead, he dozed off at his desk, the computer screen still displaying Aaliyah's determined face as she stood against the bulldozer, defending her community with the same compassion she'd once shown a lonely little boy. Morning sunlight glinted off the chain-link fence surrounding Hope Haven as Aaliyah rubbed her tired eyes. She'd been up until 2 in the morning with community organizers, planning their next steps. Her coffee hadn't kicked in yet, but determination kept her standing straight as she surveyed the temporarily halted construction site. A sleek black car pulled up to the curb, its engine purring quietly before falling silent. Aaliyah tensed, expecting another corporate lawyer with threatening paperwork. The back door opened, and a tall man in an expertly tailored suit stepped out. Something about his careful movements tugged at her memory, but exhaustion clouded her thoughts. He approached slowly, hands relaxed at his sides, studying the old brick building behind her with an unreadable expression. When he was just a few steps away, he spoke one word that stopped her heart. Aaliyah. The gentle tone struck a chord deep within her, echoing across decades. She stared at him, really looked at him now, and suddenly she was 5 years old again, offering comfort to a crying boy on his first day of school. Evan? She whispered, then immediately straightened her spine. Evan Whitford. His eyes lit up with hope, but she took a step back, crossing her arms. So the CEO himself comes to manage the PR crisis. I suppose that viral video really rattled your board. That's not why I'm here. His voice was soft but steady. When I saw you in that video, I knew I had to come. 25 years later. Bitter words spilled out before she could stop them. You disappeared without a word. One day here, gone the next. Pain flickered across his face. My father. Save it. Aaliyah shook her head. Whatever this is, nostalgia, guilt, corporate damage control, I'm not interested. These people? She gestured toward Hope Haven. They're my family, the only real one I've ever had. I won't let you destroy their home for luxury condos. I want to talk, really talk. He took a step forward. Maybe we could meet somewhere. No. The word came out sharp and final. I'm not playing this game. If you want to discuss Hope Haven, you can meet with our community board and lawyers just like anyone else. Before he could respond, her phone buzzed, another crisis needing her attention. I have to go. Please don't come here again. She turned away, refusing to acknowledge the hurt in his eyes. Across town, in the climate-controlled basement of Whitford Tower, 2 archivists carefully sorted through boxes of Maxwell Whitford's personal effects. The late CEO's sudden death had left years of accumulated belongings to catalogue. More financial records. Sighed Marcus, setting aside another folder. Wait. Lisa lifted a small wooden box from beneath some papers. This is different. Opening it revealed a child's treasures. A handful of colorful marbles, a worn baseball card, and, nestled in one corner, a small plastic ring, its once bright surface now dulled with age. Following standard procedure, Lisa photographed the contents before repacking them. The image was automatically uploaded to the catalog system, triggering a notification on Evan's phone. He was reviewing construction permits when the message arrived. Opening it absently, he froze at the sight of that simple ring. Memory crashed over him. Small hands offering comfort, a child's promise, his father's rage upon discovering where he'd been enrolled. Cancel my afternoon, he told his assistant, already heading for the elevator. All of it. In the archive room, he handled the ring with trembling fingers. How had it survived? He remembered his father confiscating it, remembered crying himself to sleep that night. Now here it was, preserved among his father's supposedly important possessions. Evan sat heavily in a nearby chair, the ring tiny in his palm. All these years he'd told himself that day wasn't real, that he'd imagined or exaggerated the connection he'd felt with the kind-hearted girl who'd reached out to him. But his father had kept the ring, perhaps as a reminder of why his son needed to be controlled, shaped, isolated from those people. I'm sorry, sir, Marcus began, but all items need to remain. This is mine. Evan's voice was rough with emotion. It was always mine. Evening shadows lengthened across Alia's small apartment as she stirred a pot of pasta, phone wedged between her ear and shoulder. Yes, Mrs. Rodriguez, I've got your petition right here. We'll present it at the council meeting next week. She made another note on the already crowded legal pad beside her stove. A knock at her door made her pause. I'll call you back tomorrow, okay? Through the peephole, she saw Evan standing in her hallway, looking somehow both powerful and lost. Her heart lurched. How had he found her address? She should ignore him. Should... Alia? His voice was muffled by the door. Please, just 5 minutes. She began to refuse, but then she saw what he held in his outstretched palm, a small plastic ring, faded but unmistakable. Her hand rose to the doorknob, hesitating there as memories and doubts warred within her. The pasta bubbled on the stove behind her. The petitions waited on her counter. Her sensible mind screamed to send him away. But her heart remembered a little boy's tears, a promise made in innocence, and the way he'd treasured her small gift even on that single, long-ago day. Her fingers rested on the lock, trembling with indecision. Alia's hand lingered on the doorknob for another long moment before she finally turned it. The door opened with a soft creak, revealing Evan standing there, still holding out the plastic ring like an offering. 5 minutes, she said firmly, stepping aside to let him in. Her small apartment was neat but lived in, with stacks of community paperwork on every surface and inspiring quotes taped to the walls. The smell of cooking pasta filled the air. Evan's expensive suit looked out of place against her worn furniture, but he didn't seem to notice as he carefully sat at her kitchen table. Your stove, Alia muttered, turning to remove the boiling pot before it overcooked. I remember how you gave me this, Evan said quietly, setting the ring on the table between them. I was crying, terrified, and you just came over and made everything better. Alia kept her back turned, focusing on draining the pasta. We were 5 years old, and the next day I was gone. His voice caught. My father, when he found out where I'd been enrolled, he was furious, called it social experimentation, said no son of his would attend a public school. She finally turned to face him, arms crossed. And that was it? 25 years of nothing? I fought him. Evan's fingers traced the ring's worn surface. Cried. Begged. But I was 5 and he swallowed hard. He controlled everything, sent me to private schools, monitored my friends, planned my whole life. The only thing he couldn't take was this ring, because he never found where I'd hidden it. Then how? It was in his personal effects. The archivists found it today. Evan looked up, meeting her eyes. He kept it all these years, probably as a reminder of why he needed to keep such a tight grip on me. Alia slowly sat across from him, her defenses wavering at the raw pain in his voice. I checked the door every morning for weeks, she admitted. I thought I'd done something wrong. God, no. Evan reached across the table instinctively, then pulled back. You were the only real friend I'd ever had, even if it was just for one day. She stared at the ring, memories washing over her. I used to imagine you'd come back. Even after I went into foster care, I'd make up stories about why you left, what you were doing. She shook her head. Eventually, I mostly forgot. Until I saw you today. When I saw that video. Evan leaned forward. Before I even saw your face clearly, I knew it was you. Your voice, your determination to protect others. You haven't changed. Neither of you, she said softly. Still that quiet, thoughtful boy, just in an expensive suit now. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. The suit's new, The rest. He gestured to the ring. Some things stay with you. They talked for hours, their coffee growing cold as Evan shared stories of his isolated childhood, his father's demanding presence, and his internal struggles to live up to impossible expectations. Aaliyah spoke of foster homes, of finding purpose in helping others, of building a family among the community she served. When Evan finally left that night, the ring remained on her table, a bridge between past and present. The next morning, Aaliyah arrived at Hope Haven to find Evan already there, dressed in jeans and a work shirt, examining the vandalized fence. "What are you doing?" she asked, watching community members eye him suspiciously from the shelter's windows. "Helping fix what's broken." He held up a handful of tools. "I may be CEO now, but I still remember which end of a hammer to hold." She couldn't help smiling. "You don't have to do this. I want to." His expression grew serious. "I want to understand this place, these people. No corporate agenda, no PR moves, just understanding." Throughout the day, Aaliyah watched as Evan worked steadily, replacing broken boards and reinforcing weak spots. When elderly Mrs. Martinez brought out lemonade for the volunteers, he sat on the porch steps with her, listening intently to her stories of the neighborhood's history. Later, a group of kids from the after-school program gathered to watch him work. Instead of shooing them away, he showed them how to safely use basic tools, praising their efforts when they helped hold boards in place. "He's not what I expected," admitted Marcus, one of the shelter's regular volunteers, as they observed Evan patiently teaching a young girl how to use a level. "No," Aaliyah said softly. "He's not." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the repaired fence, Evan offered to walk Aaliyah home. They strolled slowly through the cooling evening air, their conversation flowing naturally between memories and present concerns. "Thank you," she said suddenly, stopping under a streetlight. "For today, for being real with these people. They're remarkable." Evan's voice was warm, just like their protector. The air between them crackled with unspoken emotions, decades of what-ifs and might-have-beens. "Good night, Evan," Aaliyah said finally, climbing the steps to her building. "Good night, Aaliyah." Later that night, Aaliyah lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling fan's lazy circles. The plastic ring sat on her nightstand, its presence both comforting and unsettling. She thought of Evan's gentle patience with the shelter kids, so at odds with his corporate image, the way his eyes still crinkled when he smiled, just like when they were 5. The warmth of his shoulder brushing hers as they walked home. Across town, in his penthouse apartment, Evan sat on the edge of his king-sized bed, his thoughts full of Aaliyah's fierce dedication, her careful way of listening, how the sunset had painted her face in gold as they walked. His expensive sheets felt empty somehow, his success hollow compared to the rich community she'd built. Neither slept much that night, their minds spinning with possibilities neither dared to voice. The past and present intertwined, and somewhere between memory and hope, 2 hearts began to remember what they'd recognized all those years ago, the simple truth of belonging. The morning sun had barely touched the shelter's brick facade when Evan's car pulled up. Unlike yesterday, he arrived dressed casually in a soft blue sweater and khakis, looking more like a neighborhood volunteer than a CEO. Mrs. Martinez, already unlocking the front door, raised her eyebrows in surprise. "Good morning," Evan called out, carrying 2 paper bags of fresh bagels. "I thought I'd help with breakfast, if that's okay." Inside the shelter's well-worn kitchen, Evan rolled up his sleeves and got to work. He arranged fruit on serving trays while elderly residents shuffled in, drawn by the smell of coffee. Mr. Thompson, a former jazz musician in his 80s, watched curiously as Evan moved around the kitchen with unexpected ease. "You've done this before, haven't you?" Mr. Thompson asked, accepting a steaming mug. Evan smiled softly. My grandmother taught me to cook. Before she passed, we'd spend Sunday mornings making breakfast together. He paused, remembering. It was the only time my father couldn't interrupt with business calls. When Aaliyah arrived an hour later, she stopped in the doorway, struck by the scene before her. Evan sat at a table with 3 elderly residents, leaning in to hear Mrs. Chen's story about immigrating from China 50 years ago. His face showed genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions and laughing at all the right moments. He's been here since dawn, Marcus whispered, appearing beside her. Made sure everyone got hot coffee and fresh fruit. Who knew a big-shot CEO could scramble eggs? Aaliyah watched as Evan gently touched Mrs. Chen's hand when she grew emotional describing her late husband. There was nothing calculated about the gesture, just pure empathy. By mid-morning, the shelter's younger residents began arriving for various programs. 10-year-old Destiny, usually shy around newcomers, gravitated toward Evan during reading time. She thrust her favorite book into his hands and climbed onto his lap without hesitation. "Will you do the voices?" she asked hopefully. "I'll try my best," Evan replied, opening the worn copy of Where the Wild Things Are. Soon other children gathered around, drawn by his animated storytelling. Aaliyah observed from the doorway as he brought the characters to life, his face lighting up at their delighted reactions. Something tugged at her heart, a dangerous feeling she quickly tried to suppress. During lunch break, Evan found her in the office, sorting through donation records. "Can I ask you something?" he said quietly, settling into a chair. Aaliyah nodded, though her shoulders tensed slightly. "What was it like after I left?" His voice was gentle but direct. She stared at the papers in front of her for a long moment. "Hard," she finally answered. "My foster parents tried their best, but—" She took a deep breath. "When you're moved from home to home, you learn not to unpack your backpack completely. Never know when you'll have to leave again." Evan's face showed pain at her words. "How many homes?" 7 before I aged out of the system." She smiled sadly. "That's why this place matters so much. These kids, these seniors, they need somewhere stable, somewhere that feels like home." "And you?" Evan asked softly. "Where's home for you?" Aaliyah met his gaze. "I built it here, in this community. It's the first place I didn't feel temporary." Throughout the afternoon, Evan continued helping wherever needed, fixing a leaky faucet, carrying boxes of donations, even joining an impromptu dance session with the senior exercise group. Each time Aaliyah glanced his way, she found him fully immersed in whatever task he was doing, never checking his phone or looking impatient. As evening approached, community members began arriving for the neighborhood campaign meeting. They filled the shelter's main room with folding chairs and determined faces. Evan took a seat quietly beside Aaliyah, not speaking, but radiating steady support. She led the meeting with practiced confidence, discussing legal strategies and fundraising options. When someone mentioned the demolition company, Evan raised his hand. "I've already issued a permanent stop work order," he stated simply. "And I'd like to offer pro bono legal support from our corporate team for whatever next steps you decide." The room buzzed with surprised whispers. Aaliyah felt warmth spread through her, chest at his words, at the way he said, "You decide," instead of taking control. After the meeting, they walked together through the cooling night air. Aaliyah told him about her first day working at the shelter, how terrified she'd been of failing the people who needed her. "But you didn't fail them," Evan said softly. "You became their champion." "Sometimes I still feel like that scared kid," she admitted, "afraid of letting people down." "I know that feeling." He shook his head ruefully. "My father's voice in my head, always expecting perfection." Something about his honest vulnerability made Aaliyah laugh, a real, unguarded sound that surprised them both. Evan joined in, and suddenly they were both giggling like children, releasing years of tension. At her doorway, they lingered longer than necessary, neither wanting the evening to end. "Thank you," she said, "for today, for listening, for understanding." Evan's smile was warm. "Thank you for letting me try." After he left, Aaliyah remained in the doorway, watching his figure disappear down the street. The familiar walls of her distrust were beginning to crack, letting in something that felt dangerously like hope. For the first time in years, she didn't immediately try to rebuild them. Inside, she touched the plastic ring still sitting on a table, remembering the earnest boy who had once promised to stay. Maybe, just maybe, some promises weren't meant to be broken after all. The next morning dawned bright and crisp, with clouds gathering on the horizon promising rain later. Aaliyah waited outside the shelter, watching as Evan's car pulled up. Today he was dressed more casually in jeans and a simple button-down shirt, a far cry from his usual corporate attire. "Ready for the grand tour?" she asked as he approached. "Lead the way," he replied with a warm smile. They started down Mason Street, where Aaliyah pointed out buildings that had stood for generations. "This whole area was built by working-class families," she explained, gesturing to the brick facades. "See those decorative tiles? Local artists made those during the Great Depression, people helping people even when times were tough." They passed a small park where children played on aging equipment. The shelter started as a community center back in 1948. Aaliyah continued. "It was one of the first integrated spaces in the city. People from all backgrounds came together here when that was practically unheard of." Evan listened intently, occasionally asking questions that showed genuine interest. When they reached Harrison Avenue, Aaliyah stopped in front of a boarded-up storefront. "This used to be Mr. Chen's grocery," she said softly. "He gave food to families who couldn't afford it, never asked for anything in return. Development forced him out last year." She turned to face Evan directly. "Every building here has stories like that. Lives built, connections made, communities formed." Understanding dawned in Evan's eyes. "I never thought about it that way," he admitted. "In the boardroom, everything's just numbers on spreadsheets, profit margins, market analysis. We never discuss the human cost." Thunder rumbled overhead as they made their way back to the shelter. The first heavy drops began falling just as they reached the entrance. Inside, they found Mrs. Rodriguez, one of the senior residents, placing buckets to catch water leaking through the roof. "It's getting worse," she said, pointing upward where water was seeping through a crack in the ceiling. Without hesitation, Aaliyah headed for the maintenance closet. "Come on," she called to Evan. "Time to earn your volunteer stripes." Soon they were up on the roof, armed with tarps and sealant. Rain pelted them as they worked to patch the leaking section. Evan's expensive shirt was soaked through, but he didn't seem to care as he held the tarp steady for Aaliyah. A particularly strong gust of wind sent a spray of water into their faces, making them both sputter. Aaliyah couldn't help laughing at Evan's startled expression, his usually perfect hair plastered to his forehead. His laughter joined hers, echoing across the rooftop. As they finished securing the last corner, the rain began to ease. Evan reached into his pocket, pulling out something small that caught the emerging sunlight. "I've been carrying this everywhere lately," he said, opening his palm to reveal the plastic ring. "Do you know why I kept it all these years?" Aaliyah shook her head, her heart beating faster. "My father gave me everything money could buy," Evan continued, his voice thick with emotion. "Designer clothes, expensive toys, the best education. But this This was the first thing anyone ever gave me just because they wanted to make me happy. No agenda, no expectations, just pure kindness. Aaliyah felt tears welling up in her eyes, mixing with the raindrops on her cheeks. For so long, she'd built walls around her heart, protecting herself from the pain of abandonment. But standing here with Evan, those walls began to crumble. "I thought you'd forgotten," she whispered. "Never," he replied softly. "Not really." They made their way back inside, where the smell of cooking filled the air. The community potluck was getting underway, tables being set up with an array of dishes. Without discussing it, they fell into sync, working together to help organize the event. Aaliyah would start a task, and Evan would instinctively know how to complete it. She'd reach for a stack of plates, and he'd already be there with the napkins. When Mrs. Rodriguez asked for the green bean casserole, they both pointed to it at the same time, then shared a knowing smile. "The cornbread needs," Aaliyah began. "Butter," Evan finished, already heading to the kitchen. Throughout the evening, they moved around each other in an effortless dance, serving food, clearing plates, making sure everyone had what they needed. Community members noticed their synchronized movements, exchanging meaningful glances and hiding small smiles. As the potluck wound down, Aaliyah and Evan found themselves standing outside in the cool evening air. The storm had left everything feeling fresh and clean, stars peeking through breaks in the clouds above. Neither seemed eager to say goodnight, both aware that something had shifted between them during this rain-soaked day. They stood in comfortable silence, shoulders nearly touching, watching the last streaks of sunset paint the sky in soft purples and blues. The plastic ring sat between them on the railing, a small symbol of where their story had begun and where it might lead. The morning sun cast long shadows across the neighborhood as residents began setting up tables and hanging banners for the upcoming block party. Aaliyah stood in the center of it all, clipboard in hand, directing volunteers with gentle authority. "We'll need these tables lined up along Madison Street," she explained, gesturing to a stack of folding tables, "and the stage needs to go near the shelter entrance." When Evan arrived, dressed casually in jeans and a plain blue t-shirt, Aaliyah noticed several residents tense up. She quickly assigned him what seemed like minor tasks, organizing name tags, arranging chairs, but he approached each one with complete dedication. "These need to be alphabetical?" he asked, carefully sorting through the stack of name tags. "I can create a color-coding system for different activities too, if that would help." Ms. Jenkins, who had earlier voiced concerns about his presence, watched with growing curiosity as Evan meticulously arranged everything, stopping occasionally to help elderly residents with heavy lifting or reaching high places. Throughout the morning, more people arrived to help with preparations. Children darted between the adults, testing the chalk art stations and asking endless questions about the face painting booth that would open in 2 days. "Mr. Evan," little Marcus called out, tugging on Evan's shirt. "Can you help us test the ring toss game, please?" Aaliyah paused her work to watch as Evan spent 20 minutes showing the neighborhood kids how to aim properly, celebrating each successful throw with high fives and genuine enthusiasm. By late afternoon, most of the preliminary setup was complete. Evan had worked steadily, his expensive watch forgotten as he helped string banners, move equipment, and solve logistical problems. His quiet competence and willingness to take direction from others gradually began winning people over. "You know," Mrs. Rodriguez said to Aaliyah as they watched him help an elderly man set up his food booth, "maybe he's not so bad after all." As the sun began to set, Evan approached Aaliyah, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Have you eaten? There's this little place around the corner, Tony's. The owner was telling me about their homemade pasta while we were setting up his booth." Aaliyah hesitated for a moment, then smiled. Tony's has the best garlic bread in the city. The restaurant was warm and inviting, with checkered tablecloths and photos of 3 generations of family covering the walls. They settled into a corner booth, the familiar comfort of the place helping Alia relax. "So," Evan said after they'd ordered, "tell me about little Alia. What did you love doing as a kid?" She stirred her water with the straw, thinking. "I used to collect rocks," she admitted with a laugh. "Every foster home I went to, I'd gather interesting ones from the yard. It was something constant, you know, something I could take with me." Evan's eyes softened. "Do you still have any of them?" "Just one, a piece of rose quartz I found the day I moved into my last foster home, the one where I finally stayed until aging out." She paused. "What about you? What did little Evan do for fun in that big house?" "Honestly, I built elaborate pillow forts in my room," he said, grinning. "The staff would find me asleep in them, surrounded by books. It drove my father crazy, said it wasn't dignified." Their conversation flowed easily through dinner, sharing stories about favorite teachers, embarrassing moments, and childhood dreams. When their dessert arrived, a massive slice of tiramisu to share, Evan reached across the table. "You've got a little," he said softly, gently brushing a stray crumb from her cheek. His touch lingered for just a moment, and Alia felt warmth spread across her face. The drive home was quiet, comfortable. Evan parked and walked her to her door, their steps slow, neither wanting the evening to end. Under the porch light, he moved closer, his hand lifting to cup her face. Alia's heart raced as he leaned in, but then he pulled back, his eyes full of emotion. "Good night, Alia," he whispered, squeezing her hand before turning to leave. The next morning arrived bright and clear, perfect weather for the block party. Music filled the air as residents began arriving, carrying homemade dishes and setting up their stations. Children ran excitedly between game booths, while parents chatted near the food tables. Alia took the stage mid-morning to speak about the shelter's importance. "This building isn't just brick and mortar," she said, her voice strong and clear. "It's a home, a sanctuary, a place where hope lives and grows." Throughout the day, the celebration continued. Seniors taught young children traditional dances, teenagers ran the face-painting booth, and neighbors who had lived next door to each other for years finally stopped to really talk. Evan moved through it all with quiet grace, helping wherever needed, learning everyone's names, listening to their stories. He joined in 3-legged races with the kids, served food to elderly residents, and even attempted double Dutch jump rope at the children's insistence. As evening approached, strings of lights flickered to life overhead, casting a warm glow across the street. Music played softly in the background, old soul classics that had couples swaying together on the makeshift dance floor. Evan found Alia near the dessert table, gently took her hand, and led her to a quiet corner away from the crowd. His other hand slipped into his pocket, and he began to lower himself to one knee. The string lights twinkled overhead as Evan guided Alia away from the bustling crowd. His hand was warm in hers, and his eyes held a mix of nervousness and determination. The music drifted softly around them, an old Motown love song that made the moment feel even more special. Just as Evan began to lower himself to one knee, his phone erupted with a series of sharp buzzes. He tried to ignore it, but the vibrations continued insistently. Alia could see the conflict on his face as he reluctantly pulled the device from his pocket. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, quickly scanning the screen. His expression fell, the joy draining from his features. This isn't good." Before Alia could ask what was wrong, 2 men in expensive suits pushed through the crowd. Their presence felt jarring against the casual, festive atmosphere of the block party. The music seemed to fade as people turned to stare. "Mr. Whitford," the taller executive said sharply. "Your presence is required at headquarters immediately. The board has called an emergency meeting." The shorter man stepped forward, his voice low but firm. "This isn't a request, Evan. The situation is critical." Evan stood frozen for a moment, looking between Aaliyah and the executives. The plastic ring weighed heavily in his pocket as he struggled with his decision. Finally, his shoulders slumped slightly. "Aaliyah, I'm so sorry," he said, his voice thick with regret. "I need to handle this. I promise I'll explain everything soon." He squeezed her hand once before following the executives to a waiting car. The block party's cheerful mood deflated like a punctured balloon. People whispered in small groups, shooting concerned glances at Aaliyah. She stood rooted to the spot, watching the car's taillights disappear around the corner. Later that night, as Aaliyah was getting ready for bed, her phone chimed with a news alert. Her stomach dropped as she read the headline, "Tech CEO under fire, internal memo reveals possible misconduct." Someone had leaked a company document suggesting Evan had misused corporate resources and betrayed shareholder trust by halting the shelter's demolition. She barely slept, tossing and turning as worry gnawed at her. When dawn finally broke, she was startled by loud knocking at her door. Through the window she could see a crowd of reporters on her small front lawn, cameras and microphones at the ready. "Ms. Carter?" they called out. "Is it true you manipulated Evan Whitford to gain control of valuable real estate? Sources say you used your past connection to influence his business decisions. Care to comment?" Aaliyah's hands shook as she pulled the curtains closed. The accusations were ridiculous, but she could see how easily the media was twisting their story. She thought of the genuine moments they'd shared at the shelter, the quiet conversations, the way he'd connected with the community. None of that mattered now. It was being painted as an elaborate manipulation. Throughout the day, more damaging stories emerged. Business analysts questioned Evan's judgment. Former board members suggested he'd let emotions cloud his decision-making. By late afternoon, social media was buzzing with speculation about their childhood connection and whether Aaliyah had orchestrated the whole situation. Mrs. Rodriguez called around 6 o'clock, her voice worried. "They're saying terrible things about you on the news, Mija. None of it's true. We all saw how real it was between you two." But Aaliyah could barely hear the reassurance through her guilt. She'd let herself believe in something magical, and now Evan was paying the price. The board meeting was still in session, but online financial sites were already predicting the outcome. At 8:45 in the evening, it became official. The board had voted to remove Evan as CEO, citing his recent pattern of decisions detrimental to shareholder interests. The company's stock price had dropped 15% in a single day. Aaliyah's phone buzzed with Evan's name, but she couldn't bring herself to answer. What could she say? She'd destroyed everything he'd worked for just by letting him back into her life. The 5-year-old girl who'd given away her only treasure had grown into a woman who'd cost him his dream. Across town, Evan stood alone outside the corporate headquarters he'd helped build. The building's lights were dim, most employees having gone home hours ago. In his hand, he held the plastic ring, the symbol of the purest promise he'd ever made. Security guards watched uncomfortably as he stared up at the darkened windows, his shoulders straight despite everything he'd lost. The ring caught the faint glow of streetlights as he turned it over in his palm. 25 years ago, it had represented hope and connection to a lonely little boy. Now, as he stood in the growing darkness, it meant something even more precious, a chance to choose love over fear, truth over power, and the courage to keep a promise made in childhood innocence. The elevator doors opened silently as Evan entered his penthouse apartment. The space stretched before him, all gleaming surfaces, modern art, and floor-to-ceiling windows showcasing the city lights below. But tonight, it felt more like a museum than a home. Empty, sterile, unfamiliar. He placed his keys on the marble counter with a quiet click and pulled the plastic ring from his pocket. Walking to his dining table, a massive piece of glass and steel that could seat 12, but had never hosted more than business associates, he set the ring in the center. The small circle of painted plastic looked absurdly out of place among the luxury surrounding it. Evan sank into one of the leather chairs, his tie loose around his neck, and stared at the ring. Hours ticked by on his expensive wall clock as the city's lights twinkled beyond his windows. He hadn't just lost his position at the company he'd built from the ground up. He'd lost Aaliyah, too. The weight of both losses pressed against his chest until it was hard to breathe. "I really messed this up," he whispered to the empty apartment. Morning came, spreading pale light across his untouched bed. He hadn't slept, choosing instead to sit with his thoughts and that small piece of plastic that represented everything pure and true in his life. Across town, Aaliyah tried to maintain her usual routine at the shelter. She arrived early, as always, to help serve breakfast to the seniors. But the atmosphere had changed. Where there had once been unity, now there was tension and whispered arguments. "We shouldn't have trusted him," one volunteer muttered, loud enough for Aaliyah to hear. "Look at the mess we're in now." "But he was trying to help," Mrs. Rodriguez defended, though her voice wavered with uncertainty. The media vans remained parked outside, their presence a constant reminder of how their private world had been invaded. Aaliyah's phone buzzed repeatedly with calls from unknown numbers, reporters hungry for a story, she assumed. Several of the shelter's regular donors had withdrawn their support, worried about being associated with the controversy. The morning's newspaper sat on the counter, its headline screaming about corporate scandal and community manipulation. Aaliyah couldn't bear to read it. "We need to focus on what matters," she told her team during their morning meeting, though her voice lacked its usual confidence. "The seniors need us. The children need us." But even as she spoke, she could see the doubt in their eyes. The community was fracturing, and she felt powerless to hold it together. Around 10 o'clock, familiar footsteps echoed in the hallway. Aaliyah's heart jumped. She would know Evan's walk anywhere now. Without thinking, she slipped through the kitchen and out the back door, into the alley behind the shelter. Through the window, she caught a glimpse of him entering the main room, his shoulders slumped but his chin up, still carrying himself with quiet dignity despite everything. She pressed herself against the brick wall, closing her eyes against the tears that threatened to fall. She couldn't face him. Not after what her presence in his life had cost him. Evan stood in the shelter's main room, his eyes scanning faces that now turned away from him. He could feel Aaliyah's absence like a physical ache. One of the seniors, an elderly man who had particularly warmed to him, approached with a sad smile. "She left through the back," he said quietly. "Give her time, son. Sometimes people need space to sort things out." Evan nodded, swallowing hard. He lingered for a few more minutes, hoping Aaliyah might return, but finally turned and walked out. The journey back to his apartment felt longer than ever before, each step heavy with defeat. That evening, as he sat in his darkened living room, his laptop chimed with a new email. The subject line made him sit up straighter. "Remember Room 7, Washington Elementary?" The sender's name was Margaret Winters. Evan clicked the email open, his heart racing slightly. "Dear Mr. Whitford, I've been following the news about you and Aaliyah Carter. I don't know if you remember me. I was your kindergarten teacher for that one day at Washington Elementary 25 years ago. I've never forgotten you two children and that plastic ring. There are things you should know about that time, about why you were removed from the school so suddenly. If you're interested, I still have the class photo from that day, and some other items that might help make sense of everything. Please let me know if you'd like to meet. Best regards, Margaret Winters. Evan stared at the screen, his finger hovering over the reply button. Did he want to dig up more of the past? Would it help or just bring more pain? As he debated, another email arrived from Mrs. Winters. P.S. I'm trying to reach Aaliyah as well. Could you share her contact information? I think both of you deserve to know the whole story. The cursor blinked steadily on his screen, waiting for a response. The plastic ring sat on his table, catching the glow from his laptop, a silent reminder of where everything began. The morning sun streamed through Aaliyah's kitchen window as she stirred her coffee absently, dark circles under her eyes, testament to another sleepless night. Her phone buzzed on the counter, an unknown number. She almost ignored it, weary of reporters, but something made her answer. Hello, is this Aaliyah Carter? The voice was gentle, weathered by age but warm. This is Margaret Winters. I was your kindergarten teacher at Washington Elementary. Aaliyah's hand tightened around her mug. Mrs. Winters? I remember you. I've been trying to reach you, dear. There are some things about the past, about you and Evan Whitford, that I think you should know. Would you be willing to meet? Aaliyah hesitated, her heart picking up speed. I don't know if that's a good idea right now, with everything that's happening. Please. Mrs. Winters said softly. There's an old cafe near the school, the Morning Glory. It's quiet, away from the media. I have some things to show you. Something in the older woman's voice made Aaliyah trust her. Okay. She found herself saying. What time? An hour later, Aaliyah pushed open the cafe door, bells jingling softly above her head. The Morning Glory was nearly empty, its faded wallpaper and worn booths speaking of decades of quiet conversations. In a corner booth sat an elderly woman with silver hair and kind eyes, a leather album on the table before her. Aaliyah. Mrs. Winters smiled, standing to embrace her. You've grown into such a beautiful woman. They sat down, and a waitress brought them tea. Mrs. Winters opened the album with careful hands. I've kept these all these years, she said. I always knew that day was special, even if I didn't understand why at the time. Aaliyah leaned forward, her breath catching as she saw the first photo. There was little Evan, his hair neatly combed, wearing a blue sweater that looked too warm for the weather. He was clutching something in his hand, the plastic ring she'd given him. He wouldn't let go of it. Mrs. Winters said softly, Not even during nap time. She turned the page. Another photo showed Evan and Aaliyah sitting together during snack time, both smiling shyly at each other over graham crackers and milk. Aaliyah touched the image gently, remembering how happy she'd been to have a friend. But this, Mrs. Winters said, turning to the next page, this is what I needed you to see. The photo showed Evan the next day, his face red and streaked with tears, his small hands balled into fists. This was when they came to take him out of the school? Mrs. Winters explained, her voice thick with emotion. He fought them, Aaliyah. That little boy fought so hard. What? Aaliyah whispered, staring at the image. He kept crying, saying he needed to find the girl who gave him her marriage ring. He said he'd promised to marry you, and he couldn't break his promise. Mrs. Winters wiped a tear from her cheek. For days afterward, he would escape from his new school and try to find his way back to Washington Elementary. His father was furious. Aaliyah sat back, her world tilting on its axis. All these years, she'd thought Evan had simply forgotten her, moved on to his privileged life without a backward glance. But he had tried to come back. He had fought to keep his promise. Mrs. Winters continued turning pages, showing more photos, the empty seat where Evan had sat, the playground where they'd met. I tried to tell his father how cruel it was, separating two children who'd formed such a beautiful connection. But Maxwell Whitford wouldn't listen. He said his son needed to learn early that some relationships were beneath their family. Beneath their family? Aaliyah repeated, her voice barely audible. It was wrong, what they did to both of you, Mrs. Winters said firmly. And watching the news now, seeing how fate brought you back together, and then seeing it all fall apart again. She reached across the table, covering Aaliyah's hand with her own. I couldn't stay silent anymore. You needed to know the truth. They talked for another hour, Mrs. Winters sharing more stories about that brief time, helping Aaliyah understand just how much that single day had meant to both children. When they finally said goodbye, Mrs. Winters pressed 2 photos into Aaliyah's hands, one of her and Evan sharing cookies, and one of Evan holding the ring. In a daze, Aaliyah found herself walking to Washington Elementary. The school day was over, the playground empty and quiet in the afternoon sun. She sat on one of the old swings, the same one she'd sat on 25 years ago, watching the door for Evan to appear. The photos felt heavy in her pocket. All this time, she'd protected herself by believing she meant nothing to him. It had been easier than admitting how much that abandonment had hurt. But he hadn't abandoned her. He'd been torn away, fighting to keep his promise to a little girl who'd shown him kindness. And now she'd done exactly what his father had done, pushed him away, assumed the worst, refused to believe in the connection they shared. She'd let her fear of being hurt again blind her to the truth of who Evan had become. A man who kept that plastic ring for 25 years, who gave up everything to protect her community, who looked at her with the same gentle eyes he'd had as a child. Aaliyah stood up from the swing, her movements decisive. She knew what she had to do. The truth had been there all along, in a little boy's promise and a plastic ring, in the way Evan had never stopped trying to find his way back to her. She began walking, her pace quickening with each step, purpose burning away the doubt that had plagued her these past days. She had to find Evan. She had to tell him she understood now. She had to make this right. Aaliyah spent the evening at her small kitchen table, papers spread out before her like battle plans. Her hands shook slightly as she sorted through dozens of testimonials she'd gathered from shelter residents and community members. Each one told a story of how Evan had touched their lives over the past weeks, helping elderly Mrs. Jackson with her groceries, reading stories to the children, fixing the leaky roof in the rain. Dear board members, she practiced aloud, her voice trembling. She cleared her throat and started again, stronger this time. I'm here to tell you about the real Evan Whitford. The clock ticked past midnight, but sleep felt impossible. She rehearsed her speech until the words blurred together, trying to find the perfect way to make them understand. This wasn't just about saving Evan's job. It was about showing them the man she'd finally allowed herself to see. At 5:30 in the morning, Aaliyah stood at the bus stop, wearing her best blazer and clutching a worn leather folder. The early morning air was crisp, and her breath came out in small clouds. As the bus lurched through traffic toward downtown, she went over her notes one last time, her heart racing. The corporate tower stretched into the sky like a giant steel and glass mountain. Aaliyah's reflection in the revolving door showed a woman she barely recognized, determined, fierce, ready for battle. The security guard checked her ID with a suspicious frown, but her name was on the list of approved visitors for the 9 o'clock board meeting. In the elevator, Aaliyah closed her eyes, remembering the photo Mrs. Winters had shown her of little Evan crying as they took him away. She wouldn't let anyone separate them again. The boardroom doors were already closed when she arrived, the meeting having started a few minutes early. Through the glass walls, she could see Evan sitting alone at one end of a long table, facing a row of stern executives. His shoulders were squared, but she could see the tension in his jaw. Taking a deep breath, Aaliyah pushed open the heavy door. Every head turned towards her, and the room fell silent. Evan's eyes widened in disbelief, a mix of joy and worry crossing his face. "Excuse me," a stern-looking woman said. "This is a private disciplinary hearing." "I'm Aaliyah Carter," she announced, her voice steady despite her pounding heart. "And I'm here to speak about Evan Whitford." An older man with steel-grey hair frowned. "Ms. Carter, Mr. Whitford's reckless personal entanglement with you and your community center is precisely why we're here. Your presence is inappropriate." "Reckless?" Aaliyah stepped forward, drawing herself up to her full height. "Is that what you call compassion these days?" She opened her folder, pulling out the stack of testimonials. "I have statements here from over 50 people whose lives Evan has touched in the past few weeks. Would you like to hear what Mrs. Rose Jackson, age 82, has to say about the man you're calling reckless?" Without waiting for permission, Aaliyah began reading. "Mr. Whitford didn't just help carry my groceries. He sat with me for an hour, looking at old photos of my late husband, genuinely interested in our story. That's not the behavior of some rich CEO trying to score points. That's a man with a real heart." She moved around the table, making eye contact with each board member. "Or how about Tommy Martinez, age 8, who says Evan is the first grown-up who didn't get mad when he struggled with reading? Or Sarah Chen, who runs the corner store and watched Evan spend his own money buying supplies for the shelter?" "Ms. Carter," another executive interrupted, "these personal anecdotes don't address the serious concerns about Mr. Whitford's judgment and use of company resources." "Don't they?" Aaliyah's voice grew stronger. "Because from where I stand, Evan showed exactly the kind of judgment you should want in a leader. He saw beyond spreadsheets and profit margins to the human beings whose lives your decisions affect. He recognized that sometimes doing the right thing matters more than doing the profitable thing." She glanced at Evan, who was watching her with an expression of complete awe. "You're not punishing him for misconduct. You're punishing him for having the courage to be the kind of person his father never wanted him to be." The room grew very still. Aaliyah pulled out the old photograph Mrs. Winters had given her, the one of young Evan holding the plastic ring. "25 years ago, a little boy made a promise to always be kind, to always do what's right. You're sitting here today because that boy grew into a man who kept his promise." Her voice softened, but remained clear and firm. "If you want to fire someone for showing integrity, for demonstrating real leadership, for proving that business and humanity can coexist, then go ahead. But know that you're not just losing a CEO. You're losing the rare kind of person who can transform a company from a soulless machine into a force for genuine good in this world." Aaliyah placed the testimonials on the table, along with the photograph. "I'll leave these with you. Read them. Then ask yourselves, is this really the kind of man you want to punish? Or is he exactly the kind of leader you need?" The silence that followed was absolute. Board members exchanged uncertain glances. Evan sat perfectly still, his eyes never leaving Aaliyah's face. The tension in the room was electric, charged with the weight of her words and the truth they carried. The heavy silence following Aaliyah's testimony was broken by a board member clearing his throat. "Ms. Carter, you mentioned corruption in the redevelopment project. Could you elaborate?" Aaliyah pulled out another folder. "During my research into the shelter's history, I discovered irregular payments between shell companies tied to your development subsidiary. The demolition contract was awarded to a firm that doesn't exist except on paper." She laid out document after document. "There's more. Environmental impact studies were falsified, community feedback sessions were never actually held, and historical preservation requirements were circumvented through bribes." The board members huddled together, whispers growing increasingly concerned. The stern woman who had initially dismissed Aaliyah now looked ashen. After several minutes of hushed discussion, the grey-haired man stood up. In light of these troubling allegations, we'll need to pause these proceedings for a thorough investigation. He straightened his tie nervously. Ms. Carter, we'll require copies of all your documentation. Word spread quickly. By the time Aaliyah stepped out of the boardroom, reporters had already gathered in the lobby below. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, she could see camera flashes and a growing crowd of journalists. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Evan following her into the hallway. His eyes were red-rimmed, his usually perfect suit slightly rumpled. They stood there for a moment, the weight of everything between them hanging in the air. "You came," he said softly, his voice rough with emotion. "I had to." Aaliyah's hands trembled slightly. "I couldn't let them punish you for being the person I always knew you were." Evan took a step closer. "Aaliyah, that day at the block party?" "I know." She interrupted, tears welling up. "I know what you were going to do, and I ran away because I was terrified." "Of me?" She shook her head, wiping her eyes. "Of believing in something that seemed too good to be true. Every time I've trusted someone, they've left. My parents, foster families, everyone. When those executives showed up and you had to leave, it felt like kindergarten all over again." "I never wanted to leave you." Evan's voice cracked. "Not then, not now. My father, he saw us together that day and decided I needed to be somewhere more suitable for a Whitford. I cried for weeks. I kept that plastic ring until the day he finally took it away." "Mrs. Winters showed me the photos," Aaliyah said. "She told me how you kept asking about me." Evan reached for her hand, his touch gentle. "You were the first person who ever showed me real kindness, who saw me as just Evan, not a Whitford. When I recognized you in that video, it felt like the universe giving me a second chance." "And I pushed you away," Aaliyah whispered, guilt heavy in her voice. "You were protecting yourself. But Aaliyah..." He stepped closer, taking both her hands in his. "You don't have to protect yourself from me. That little boy who promised to marry you, he meant every word. And the man standing here now, he's been falling in love with you all over again, watching you fight for your community, seeing your strength and your heart." Tears spilled down Aaliyah's cheeks. "When you left the block party, I convinced myself I'd ruined your life, that I'd been foolish to think someone like you could really want someone like me." "Someone like you?" Evan's voice was fierce. "You mean someone brilliant, compassionate, and brave? Someone who stands up to bulldozers and corporate boards? Someone who makes everyone around her feel valued and heard?" He reached up to wipe away her tears. "Aaliyah, you're everything I want to be." She let out a sob and fell into his arms. They clung to each other, both crying now, years of loneliness and misunderstanding washing away. Evan buried his face in her hair, murmuring, "I'm sorry," over and over, while Aaliyah pressed her face against his chest, finally letting herself feel safe. When they eventually pulled back slightly, their faces were wet but their eyes were clear. The sound of reporters calling their names drifted up from the lobby below. Evan gave a watery chuckle. "Quite an audience down there." "Let them wait," Aaliyah said, reaching up to straighten his tie. "We've waited 25 years for this moment." Speaking of waiting, Evan reached into his pocket and pulled out the plastic ring. Faded, but intact. "I had the archives department searching for weeks to find this. I was going to give it back to you at the block party, along with a real one." Aaliyah's breath caught. "You were really going to..." "I still want to," he said softly. "Not right this second. We have some corporate corruption to expose first, but soon." He squeezed her hand. "If you'll have me." She smiled through her tears. "I think I've been waiting. For you since kindergarten." The clamor of reporters grew louder below. Evan tucked the ring safely back into his pocket and turned to Aaliyah, extending his hand. Ms. Carter, would you do me the honor of walking downstairs with me? I think it's time we faced the world together. Aaliyah looked at his offered hand, remembering a similar gesture from a small boy 25 years ago. This time, there would be no separation, no misunderstandings, no running away. She placed her hand in his, their fingers intertwining naturally. The glass doors of the corporate tower swung open as Evan and Aaliyah stepped out hand in hand into the bright afternoon sunlight. They paused momentarily on the top step, taken aback by the size of the crowd that had gathered. The sidewalk was packed with familiar faces from every corner of their lives. Elderly residents from the shelter stood near the front, some leaning on canes or walkers, their weathered faces beaming with pride. Ms. Rose, the shelter's oldest resident at 87 years old, dabbed at her eyes with the tissue. Behind them, dozens of neighborhood children bounced excitedly, waving hand-drawn signs with hearts and messages of support. Company employees who had worked closely with Evan lined the steps, many still in their business attire, but wearing warm smiles that showed their true allegiance. Even Janet from accounting, known for her stern demeanor, was wiping away tears. The crowd erupted in cheers as soon as they appeared. "We love you, Aaliyah!" Several shelter residents called out. "Boss man!" Some employees shouted, pumping their fists in the air. Evan squeezed Aaliyah's hand, drawing strength from her presence. The morning sun caught in her dark curls, creating a soft halo effect that made his heart skip. She looked up at him with those same kind eyes that had first captured his heart in kindergarten, and he knew this was the moment. "Wait," he said softly, just loud enough for her to hear over the crowd's enthusiasm. Evan reached into his suit pocket and carefully withdrew the plastic ring, the very same one she had given him 30 years ago. Its surface was slightly scratched, and the once bright blue color had faded to a gentle pastel, but it was still perfectly intact, preserved by decades of careful handling. The crowd grew quiet as they watched him hold it up. Aaliyah's eyes widened, glistening with tears as she recognized it. "You really kept it all these years?" She whispered. "It was my most precious possession." Evan said, his voice carrying in the hushed silence. "The first gift anyone ever gave me just because they wanted to make me happy." He held the ring between them, his hands trembling slightly. "Aaliyah Carter, will you accept this ring again? Not just as a token of friendship this time, but as a promise of forever." Tears spilled down Aaliyah's cheeks as she nodded. "Yes," she managed to say, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, of course, yes." With infinite tenderness, Evan slipped the plastic ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit, just as it had been when they were children. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause, but the couple barely noticed, lost in their own world of shared memories and renewed promises. Then Evan reached into his other pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. "I have something else for you too," he said, opening it to reveal a stunning engagement ring. The diamond caught the sunlight, sending rainbow reflections dancing across Aaliyah's face, but what made her gasp wasn't the stone's beauty. It was the way Evan had arranged it. The plastic ring lay nestled next to the diamond ring in the velvet lining, the two pieces displayed side by side as equals. "They belong together," Evan explained, his voice full of emotion. "Just like us. The past and the present, the promise and its fulfillment." He carefully lifted the diamond ring. "Will you wear this one too?" "Together," Aaliyah agreed, her smile radiant through her tears. "Always together." Evan slipped the diamond ring onto her finger next to the plastic one, and the crowd's cheering reached new heights. Reporters' cameras flashed rapidly, capturing the moment from every angle. Someone started singing "At Last," and others quickly joined in. Ms. Rose made her way forward, supported by 2 other shelter residents. "I knew it," she declared, her voice quavering but proud. "I told everyone that boy was special the first day he showed up to help serve breakfast. You can't fake a good heart." Little Maria, one of the shelter's youngest residents, broke free from her mother's grasp and ran up the steps to hug Aaliyah's legs. "Does this mean Mr. Evan is staying forever?" she asked hopefully. Aaliyah lifted the girl into her arms, sharing a loving look with Evan. "Yes, sweetheart. Mr. Evan is staying forever." The corporate employees began to chant Evan's name, showing their support for their former CEO. Several board members who had witnessed Aaliyah's testimony stood at the edges of the crowd, their expressions thoughtful as they watched the scene unfold. Evan wrapped his arm around Aaliyah's waist, pulling her close. The plastic ring and diamond ring caught the light together as she reached up to touch his face. Their lips met in a kiss that had been 30 years in the making, sweet and sure and full of promise. The crowd's cheers swelled around them, a joyful celebration of love that had endured separation, misunderstanding, and time itself to finally find its way home. As they held each other close, both rings glinting on Aaliyah's finger, they knew that some promises were meant to last forever, especially those made with plastic rings and pure hearts on the first day of kindergarten. The following days brought a gentle settling, like dust motes finding their place in afternoon sunlight. The media storm that had swirled around Evan and Aaliyah gradually calmed, replaced by a steady rhythm of purposeful work and quiet joy. On a crisp Monday morning, Evan stood before his former board one final time. His resignation letter was brief but clear, reflecting the same integrity that had marked his entire career. As he placed his company badge on the polished conference table, several board members avoided his gaze, still processing how their hasty judgments had nearly destroyed something precious. "I wish you all the best," Evan said simply, then walked out with his head held high. That same afternoon, he signed the papers establishing the Whitford Community Foundation. The mission statement, crafted with Aaliyah's input, was elegantly straightforward. Preserving spaces that preserve communities. Their first act was to transfer ownership of the shelter property into a protected trust, ensuring it would remain a sanctuary for generations to come. "You're sure about this?" Aaliyah asked as they sat in their new shared office, surrounded by moving boxes and fresh paint smell. "Running a foundation is different from running a corporation." Evan smiled, reaching across their desks to take her hand. "I've never been more sure of anything, except asking you to marry me, of course." The shelter flourished under their combined leadership. Aaliyah's deep understanding of community needs paired perfectly with Evan's business acumen. They expanded services, added after-school programs, and started a job training center. The old building seemed to glow with renewed purpose, its worn brick walls containing more hope than ever before. Ms. Rose, the shelter's eldest resident at 87 years old, took particular delight in teasing Aaliyah about their engagement. 30 years and counting, she would say with a mischievous twinkle in her eye. "Must be some kind of record." "Good things take time, Ms. Rose," Aaliyah would reply, laughing as she helped the older woman with her morning crossword puzzle. Ms. Rose would respond, pretending to be serious. "At this rate, I'll be dancing at your wedding from my heavenly cloud." One particularly beautiful afternoon, as golden autumn light filtered through the shelter's windows, Evan appeared in Aaliyah's office doorway. He wore that soft smile she had first fallen in love with in kindergarten, now somehow even more endearing on his adult face. "Take a walk with me?" he asked, holding out his hand. Aaliyah glanced at her desk calendar, covered in meeting notes and program schedules. "Now?" "Now," he confirmed. "The foundation won't collapse if we disappear for an hour." She took his hand, letting him lead her out into the peaceful afternoon. They walked slowly, enjoying the familiar neighborhood sights. The corner store where Mr. Johnson always gave neighborhood kids free candy, the small park where local artists painted murals, the community garden that supplied fresh vegetables to shelter residents. As they turned onto their old elementary school street, Aaliyah's heart quickened. The building had been converted into a community center years ago, but it still held the essence of their shared beginning. Children's artwork decorated the windows, and the sound of an after-school program drifted from the playground. Evan guided her through the front doors, nodding hello to the center's director. They climbed the worn stairs to the second floor, their footsteps echoing in the quiet hallway. When they reached their old kindergarten classroom, Aaliyah paused in the doorway, overwhelmed by memories. The room was different now, used for adult education classes and community meetings, but the bones were the same. The large windows still let in streams of sunlight, the wooden floor still creaked in certain spots, and the old chalkboard still dominated the front wall. Evan walked to the board and picked up a piece of chalk. His handwriting was deliberate as he wrote two simple words: "Promise kept." Aaliyah moved closer, her heart full. The plastic ring on her finger caught the late afternoon light, its faded blue surface somehow more beautiful for all the years it had witnessed. She reached up and kissed Evan's cheek, letting her lips linger against his skin. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" "For being the one person in my life who never broke a promise." Evan turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. The sunlight streaming through the windows wrapped around them like a warm embrace, turning the dust motes into tiny dancing stars. "Thank you," he replied softly, "for being the first person who ever showed me what love looks like." They stood together in that golden moment, surrounded by the echoes of their shared past and the bright promise of their future. The plastic ring and diamond ring glinted side by side on Aaliyah's finger, physical reminders of a connection that had endured 3 decades of separation only to emerge stronger. In that warm classroom glow, they were both 5 years old again, the shy little girl offering comfort to a crying classmate, the lonely little boy making a promise he would spend his life keeping. They were also fully, beautifully present, the woman who had never stopped fighting for her community, the man who had found his way back to his true purpose. Their love story had begun in this very room, with a plastic ring and a child's promise. Now, standing in the same space 30 years later, they were ready to write their next chapter together. Thank you for being here. If something in this story stayed with you, I'd love to see you again. Subscribe, and tomorrow I'll bring you another story crafted with heart.